Los Angeles was still asleep. Not the version you see on television, not the traffic, the lights, the noise, but the other version, the quiet one, the one that exists just before dawn, when even a city built on performance finally lets its guard down. In a neighborhood tucked away from the chaos, in Encino, behind closed doors and trimmed hedges, everything looked exactly as it should. A home, a family, a life that, from the outside, felt complete. Inside the house, nothing appeared broken. No signs of urgency. No flashing warnings. No reason, at least not an obvious one, for what was about to happen. Upstairs, a man was asleep. Not just any man. Phil Hartman, a voice millions recognized instantly, a face that had become part of American culture, a performer trusted to bring order to chaos, on screen and off. The kind of man people leaned on. The kind of man who fixed things. And for the first time that day, he was completely still. No characters. No timing. No expectations. Just rest. Somewhere in that same house, something had already changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. Enough that the rhythm of that home, the same rhythm that had carried it through years of ordinary days, was no longer holding. And then, in the kind of silence that makes even small sounds feel heavy, everything broke. No audience heard it. No cameras captured it. No one outside that house knew what had just happened. Because tragedies like this don't announce themselves. They don't build up like storms you can see coming. They happen in private, behind walls, between people who once shared everything. By the time the sun began to rise over Los Angeles, casting that soft, golden light across streets that would soon come alive again, the story had already ended. Phil Hartman was gone. Not after long decline. Not after a public unraveling. Not in the spotlight where people might expect it, but here, in the one place that should have been the safest. His home, his bedroom, his bed. And that's what makes this story different, because it doesn't begin with danger. It doesn't begin with fear. It begins with something far more familiar, a life that looked stable, a relationship that, from the outside, still functioned, a family that, in many ways, was real. To understand how something like this happens, you can't start with the final moment. You have to go back to the life that came before it, to the man people thought they knew, and to the quiet, almost invisible fractures that were already there long before that night. Phil Hartman wasn't built like most comedians. He didn't enter a room trying to dominate it. He didn't need to be the loudest voice. He didn't chase attention. He watched, and that difference, subtle at first, would become everything. Phil Hartman was born in 1948 in Brantford, Ontario, one of 8 children, a big household, constant movement, competing energy. In that kind of environment, you learn something quickly. If you want to be seen, you either get louder or you get sharper. Phil chose sharper. He studied people, not in an obvious way, not like a performer practicing lines, but quietly. Expressions, timing, the small shifts in tone reveal what someone is really thinking. These weren't things he talked about, but they stayed with him. When his family eventually moved to California, the path in front of him didn't look anything like Hollywood. There was no early push toward comedy, no childhood reputation as the funny one. If anything, he seemed like someone built for a completely different life. Structured, practical, controlled. So he followed that path. Graphic design. He enrolled at California State University, Northridge, studied visual communication, and stepped into a career that made sense. Stable work, predictable outcomes, clear expectations. And he was good at it. Not average, good. He worked on album covers for bands like America and Poco, professional clients, real deadlines, real recognition. This wasn't a stepping stone. This was a life he could have stayed in. That part is often overlooked, but it matters. Before the fame, before the characters, before millions of people recognize his voice, Phil Hartman had already built a legitimate career. He knew how to work. He knew how to create without being seen. And most importantly, he was comfortable in the background. That tells you something essential about him, Because most people who chase comedy are chasing attention. Phil wasn't. He was chasing something else. But over time, something began to change. Not suddenly, not dramatically. The kind of shift you don't notice at first, until you realize you're already moving in a different direction. Maybe it was the repetition, the predictability, the sense that everything was controlled, but nothing was alive. Or maybe it was something more internal. That quiet skill he had always carried with him. That ability to read people, to understand rhythm, to see how moments unfold. Starting to feel and used. Because here's the truth. When you understand people at that level, you don't just observe them. You start to imagine them. Different versions, different voices, different reactions. And eventually, watching isn't enough anymore. There's no single moment you can point to and say, that's when everything changed. No dramatic turning point. No sudden leap into comedy. But something inside him had started to move. Slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. A shift away from structure towards something unpredictable. And that's what makes this part of the story so important. Because when people look back later, they often assume the path was obvious. That he was always meant for the stage. Always meant to be seen. But he wasn't. He built a life where he didn't have to be. And then he walked away from it. Not because he needed fame. Not because he needed validation. But because he understood something most people don't. People themselves. How do they think? How they react? How they fall apart and come back together. And that kind of understanding doesn't stay quiet forever. Eventually, it finds a stage. And when it did, it didn't just change his career. It changed everything. By the mid-1970s, something had already shifted inside Phil Hartman. Not loudly, not in a way that drew attention, but enough to pull him somewhere new. Los Angeles was full of performers chasing visibility. Auditions, rejections, late nights, small wins. But Phil didn't enter that world the way most people did. He wasn't chasing a spotlight. He was looking for something that made sense. And that's how he found the Groundlings. At first glance, it didn't look like much. A small improv group, a training space, a place where unknown performers tested ideas that sometimes worked and often didn't. But underneath that chaos, there was structure. And that's what Phil recognized immediately. Because improv isn't just about being funny. It's about timing, listening, knowing when to step forward and when to hold everything together from background. And that's where Phil became something rare. Not the loudest person in the room, not the one chasing the biggest laugh, but the one everyone depended on. When a scene started to fall apart, Phil didn't panic. He adjusted, he grounded it, he gave it direction. Other performers could go bigger, take risks, push boundaries, because Phil was there, stabilizing the moment. That's not flashy. It doesn't always get applause. But inside that room, it made him essential. There's a difference between being funny and making something work. Phil understood that difference better than most. And over time, something else became clear. He wasn't just performing. He was building. During this period, Phil worked closely with Paul Reubens. Together, they helped shape what would become the world of Pee Wee Herman. Phil co-wrote Pee Wee's Big Adventure. He performed as Captain Carl in the stage show and television appearances. These are documented contributions, not background rumors, not exaggerated credits. He wasn't just part of the process. He helped construct it. And that's where the real transformation happened. Because now, Phil wasn't just understanding people. He was creating them. Characters with distinct voices, personalities that felt real, moments that held together because he knew exactly how they should unfold. This wasn't accidental. This was precision. And still, he didn't need to be the center of it. That's what made him different. He didn't need to dominate the stage. He needed the scene to work. And that distinction, small as it seems, would follow him everywhere. Because the same instinct that made him invaluable in comedy, the instinct to stabilize, to absorb tension, to hold things together quietly, doesn't always stay confined to a stage. Sometimes it shows up in relationships, in conflict, in silence, and sometimes holding everything together means caring more than anyone realizes. By the time Phil left the Groundlings, he wasn't just ready for the next step. He had already become something most performers spend years trying to be: reliable, adaptable, essential. And the next place he took that skill would make him known to millions, but it would also reinforce something deeper, a pattern that, years later, would matter more than anyone could have expected. By the time Phil Hartman arrived at Saturday Night Live in 1986, he wasn't chasing a breakthrough. He was stepping into a system he already understood. SNL wasn't just a show. It was pressure, live television, fast writing, unpredictable performances, a place where even talented people could fall apart. And yet, Phil didn't just survive it. He stabilized it. Almost immediately, something became clear. He wasn't there to compete for attention. He was there to make everything work. When sketches started to drift, Phil anchored them. When performances went too far, he balanced them. When chaos threatened to take over, he controlled it. That's why cast members gave him a name that stuck: the Glue. He could play anyone: a president delivering a speech with absolute authority, an announcer who sounded more real than the real thing that a salesman, confident and convincing that, or just a completely normal man, standing in the middle of something ridiculous and making it believable. And he did all of it without drawing attention to the effort. No strain, no visible calculation, just precision. Because Phil didn't approach comedy like a performance. He approached it like a structure. Every line had a purpose. Every pause had timing. Every character had weight. Other performers could take risks because they knew if things started to fall apart, Phil would catch it. That kind of reliability is rare. And in a place like SNL, it's everything. Over 8 seasons, he didn't just become recognizable. He became essential. But here's what makes this part of the story so important. He didn't burn out. He didn't fade. He didn't struggle to keep up. He left on his own terms. And when he did, the transition wasn't uncertain. It was seamless. He stepped into news radio. And once again, he wasn't just another actor. He was the steady center of the show. At the same time, his voice became instantly recognizable to millions through The Simpsons. Characters like Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz. Distinct, memorable, iconic. He wasn't reinventing himself. He didn't need to. He was doing what he had always done: understanding people and building something that worked. This wasn't luck. It wasn't timing. It wasn't a single breakthrough moment. It was consistent. The same qualities that defined him at the Groundlings, discipline, awareness, control, had carried him to the highest level of his career. And from the outside, everything looked stable. But stability can be misleading, because what people saw was a version of Phil that functioned perfectly in public. What they didn't see was how that same instinct to hold everything together played out in private. Success changes things. Schedules grow. Expectations rise. Time becomes limited. And while Phil's professional life moved forward with precision, his personal life was becoming something harder to manage. Not chaotic, not visibly broken, but it's more complicated. Because the same man who could stabilize an entire live television show couldn't control everything. And the space between those two realities, public stability and private complexity, was beginning to grow. At first, it didn't look like a problem, but over time, it became something no one could ignore. In 1987, Phil Hartman got married. Her name was Bryn Hartman. And this is where the story becomes more complicated. Not louder, not more dramatic, just harder to reduce. Because it's easy, especially in hindsight, to simplify stories like this, to assign roles, to turn people into clear categories. But that approach doesn't just flatten the truth. It hides it. So before anything else, this part needs to be handled carefully. Bryn had come to California with ambition. She pursued modeling, acting. She worked. She tried to build something in a city where success isn't easy. At the same time, there were struggles, documented struggles. including substance use in earlier years. Her family would later acknowledge that this had been a real issue at different points in her life. But that's not the full picture. People who knew her earlier described someone very different from the final headlines. Warm, social, engaging, the kind of person who could walk into a room and shift its energy. And those two realities, ambition and struggle, warmth and instability, existed at the same time. When she and Phil came together, it made sense, at least at first. He brought steadiness, structure, control. She brought energy, presence, movement. From the outside, it looked like a balance. And this part matters more than people expect. This was not a loveless marriage. They'd built a life together. They had children, a son and a daughter, and by multiple accounts, they were both loving parents. Phil, who often seemed controlled in public, softened at home, especially with his children. Bryn, too, was described as involved, affectionate, and present. There were real moments inside that house, not staged, not imagined, family routines, laughter, ordinary days that didn't feel like anything unusual until later. And that's what makes what comes next harder to understand. Because this wasn't a relationship built on nothing. It was built on something real. But over time, something shifted. Not all at once. Not in a way that drew immediate attention. Phil's career continued to rise. Steadily. Predictably. From Saturday Night Live to news radio to The Simpsons. Momentum. Recognition. Stability. Bryn's path didn't follow the same trajectory. And that gap, even if no one talked about it directly, was there, not as a single defining problem, but as something that quietly influenced everything. Because in relationships, imbalance doesn't always show up as conflict. Sometimes it shows up as a comparison, as insecurity, as the slow feeling of being left behind. Reports from friends and later accounts suggest periods of tension, moments where things felt unstable. Feelings that weren't always resolved. There were suggestions of insecurity, jealousy at times, frustration, but also something else. Cycles, arguments followed by reconciliation, tension followed by calm. A pattern that didn't collapse, but didn't fully stabilize either. Phil, on the other hand, was described in a very specific way. Not confrontational, not explosive, but withdrawn. When conflict surfaced, he didn't escalate it. He stepped away. He disengaged. And from the outside, that can look like control, even peace. But inside a relationship, especially one already under strain, withdrawal doesn't always resolve tension. Sometimes it deepens it because one person steps back and the other feels it as distance. That distance grows. The response intensifies and the cycle repeats. Not dramatic enough to end things, not stable enough to fully heal them, just unresolved. And here's the part that often gets overlooked, but changes how this story is understood. This marriage was not universally seen as collapsing, not by everyone close to them. There are documented accounts suggesting something important. They were trying to fix it. Counseling, effort, conversations about making things better. Bryn's brother would later say that both of them believed it was helping. And that matters, because it means, by early 1998, this was a relationship everyone expected to end. It wasn't written off. It wasn't beyond repair. It existed in a space many people recognize, but rarely talk about clearly. Not stable, not broken, functioning, but fragile. And in that kind of space, everything can feel manageable until one moment changes everything. And that moment was closer than anyone realized. May 27th, 1998, a day that, on paper, looked ordinary. No major public events are tied to it. No known disruptions. No visible signals that anything was about to change. For Phil Hartman and Bryn Hartman, it began like many other days in their life at that time. Routine, familiarity, a continuation of everything that had already been built. And that's exactly what makes this part of the story difficult to process. Because there are no clear warning signs that stand out in isolation. No single documented moment that, on its own, explains what would follow, just a sequence of events that, individually, appear unremarkable. That evening, Bryn left the home. She spent time outside the house. She consumed alcohol during the night. She returned home later than expected. These are established points in the timeline. Nothing speculative, nothing exaggerated, just the outline of the evening as it's been reconstructed. At some point after returning home, an argument occurred. Not unusual in itself, not unexpected. Given the context that had been building over time, we do not know every word that was said. We do not have a complete record of the conversation, and that matters, because strong storytelling and accurate storytelling has to acknowledge where the record ends and uncertainty begin. What is known is not the full emotional texture of that moment, only its existence. In situations like this, patterns often matter more than isolated incidents, and earlier patterns in the relationship suggest something consistent. Conflict did not always escalate outward. Sometimes it followed a quieter path. Phil, by multiple accounts, had a tendency to withdraw during tense moments, not to escalate, not to prolong the confrontation, but to step away. That same pattern appears to have repeated that night. After the argument, he disengaged. He went to bed. No further interaction is documented at that point. No indication of continued discussion. No known attempt to revisit the argument immediately. Just a return to separation within the same home. And in many ways, that should have been the end of the night. A disagreement. A pause. Sleep. A reset that, under different circumstances, would have allowed the next day to begin with distance clarity or resolution. But this night did not continue that way, because beneath the surface of what looked like an ordinary sequence of events, there were unresolved pressures that had been building over time. And once the house became quiet, those pressures no longer had anywhere to go. What happened after this point would take place in that same quiet space, in the early hours, when the day had fully ended and the consequences of that evening were still unfolding. Tone, restrained, factual, almost clinical. Let the gravity come from the facts themselves, not embellishment. In the early hours of May 28, 1998, the house was quiet. The argument from earlier in the evening had ended. The lights had gone out. The normal rhythm of the home had settled into stillness. Inside that silence, Phil Hartman was asleep. At some point during those early morning hours, he was shot. What is known from official findings and reports. Phil Hartman was shot 3 times. There were no signs of a struggle inside the immediate scene. There were no indications of defensive wounds or prolonged physical altercation. The absence of a struggle is significant from an investigative standpoint. It suggests that the victim was likely asleep or otherwise unaware of the immediate threat when the shots were fired. This aligns with the physical evidence observed at the scene. There were no witnesses, no immediate external interruption, no documented attempt at escape or defense during the incident itself. Just a sequence of actions that occur within a confined space in a short window of time without external visibility. From an investigative perspective, the scene is understood through its physical evidence rather than direct accounts of the moment itself. Ballistics, positioning, entry points, room layout, these elements form the basis of what can be confirmed. And beyond those facts, there is no additional verified detail about the exact sequence of moments inside that room during the incident. No recorded dialogue. No reconstructed timeline of conscious interaction at that instant. No indication of escalation at the moment the shots were fired. Just the outcome and the evidence left behind. What followed next would not occur inside that room, but outside of it, where the consequences of that moment began to extend beyond the walls of the home. This is the point in the timeline where the case shifts. Up until now, the events inside the home remain contained within that space. But what happened next moved beyond the house. After the shooting, Bryn Hartman left the residence. There was no immediate public awareness of what had occurred. No emergency response had yet arrived at the scene. At that moment, the situation still existed in isolation. Bryn went to the home of a friend, Ron Douglas. When she arrived, she made a direct statement. She told him that something had happened at the house. Specifically, she confessed that she had been involved in a shooting. At first, Ron Douglas did not believe her. That reaction is documented in accounts of the incident. The claim was unexpected that it did not immediately register as real. Because of the uncertainty, they returned to the residence together. This step is important from an investigative standpoint. It represents a move from verbal admission to physical verification. Upon arrival at the home, Ron Douglas was able to confirm that something serious had occurred inside. At that point, the situation could no longer be treated as uncertain or hypothetical. He then contacted emergency services. A 911 call was placed to report the incident. Once authorities were notified, the case moved into an active response phase. Police units were dispatched to the location. The situation was no longer contained within personal knowledge. It had entered an official emergency framework. As law enforcement began responding to scene, Bryn returned inside the home. She then went into a bedroom and locked herself inside. What followed was a critical and final development in the sequence of events. Bryn died by suicide. No further interaction from others inside the home altered that outcome. Emergency responders arrived in the aftermath of these events, but by that point, the situation had already reached its conclusion. At this stage, the immediate crisis had ended, but the case itself had not. What remained was the task of understanding how the timeline unfolded. How are the events inside the home connected to the actions outside it? And what investigative conclusions could be drawn from the evidence left behind? And as authorities began to examine the scene, the focus shifted from response to reconstruction, because what happened in those final moments didn't just close a single night. It defined the final chapter of a much longer story that had been building for years. After emergency responders secured the scene, the case transitioned into a formal investigation. At this stage, the focus shifted away from the immediate sequence of events and toward verification of what could be supported by physical and forensic evidence. Hard facts from investigative and toxicology reports. Phil Hartman had no drugs in his system at the time of death. Bryn Hartman had alcohol present, with a blood alcohol level reported at approximately 0.12. Additional substances identified in Bryn's system included cocaine and prescribed medication. These findings come from post-incident toxicology analysis and are part of the established record. Individually, these data points describe conditions present at the time of the incident, but they do not on their own explain intent, motivation, or the full psychological context of the events. From an investigative perspective, it is critical not to reduce the outcome to any single variable, not substances, not a single argument, not a singular moment of conflict. Cases like this are rarely the result of one isolated cause. Instead, they are typically understood through a combination of factors that interact over time. In reviewing the available information, the case is most consistently interpreted as a convergence of multiple elements. Marital strain, long-term interpersonal tension within a relationship, documented through patterns of conflict and reconciliation. Substance use, presence of alcohol and other substances, which can affect judgment, inhibition, and emotional regulation. Emotional instability, reported fluctuations in mood, stress, and interpersonal dynamics. Access to a firearm, the presence of means that allowed a conflict to escalate into a fatal outcome. Established conflict patterns, a recurring cycle where disagreements were followed by withdrawal rather than resolution. None of these elements alone fully determines a specific outcome, but when they exist together, they can influence how situations develop in critical moments. From a forensic standpoint, investigators typically reconstruct events by aligning physical evidence from the scene, toxicology results, documented timelines, witness statements and admissions, known behavioral patterns preceding the incident. In this case, those components collectively provide a framework that explains what happened, but not in the simplified, single-cause way that narratives often attempt. The most responsible interpretation is not to isolate one explanation, but to recognize interaction between multiple contributing conditions, a relationship under strain, a moment of conflict, substances present that may have affected perception and decision-making, and a sequence of actions that unfolded quickly once escalation began. From an investigative perspective, the case does not point to a single driving factor. It reflects a convergence of circumstances that, at a critical moment, aligned in a way that allowed a private conflict to become irreversible. And once that convergence occurred, the consequences extended far beyond that single night into the lives of those connected to the people involved, and into how the story would later be understood and remembered. In the immediate aftermath of the events inside that home, the focus naturally went to what had happened, the timeline, the investigation, the sequence of irreversible moments. But beyond all of that, 2 children had to live with the consequences. 2 children survived. That fact doesn't always sit at the center of discussions about this case, but it should remain present when the story is fully understood, because they were not distant observers. They were part of that household. They lived inside that environment every day. They were present in the life that had been built by Phil Hartman and Bryn Hartman, a home that, at one point, contained routine, structure, and family life. And then, suddenly, it didn't. Following the events of May 28th, 1998, the children were removed from the immediate situation. They were placed into the care of family members. This transition was not public-facing in its details, but it followed the standard approach used in situations involving the sudden loss of parents. From that point forward, their upbringing continued outside of the environment where the incident occurred, away from the physical location of the tragedy, away from the immediate aftermath. One of the most significant decisions made in the aftermath was to maintain their privacy. That meant limiting exposure to media coverage, avoiding public attention, allowing them to grow up without being constantly associated with the events that defined public discussion of their parents. In high-profile cases, media attention can become overwhelming. Speculation, repetition of details, public commentary that often lacks nuance. In this case, shielding the children from that environment was a way to preserve something they could still have, a sense of normalcy. At the time, the story received widespread coverage due to the public profile of Phil Hartman. He was known through major platforms like Saturday Night Live, News Radio, and The Simpsons. That visibility meant the aftermath was not a private matter in the traditional sense. But despite that, the children themselves were largely kept out of the public narrative. And that's where the tone of the story changes. Because up to this point, the focus has been on timelines, investigation, events, causes. But those elements don't fully capture what remains after the facts are established. This wasn't just a case that ended with a report. It was a case that continued in the lives of people who didn't choose any part of it. 2 children lost their parents in a single night, not in a gradual way, not over time, but suddenly, and beyond the public narrative, beyond the analysis, beyond the reconstruction of events. That is the part that endures. Stories like this often get discussed in terms of causes and outcomes. But underneath that, some lives continue. The children who grew up after that night did so away from the spotlight, away from the constant retelling of the incident, protected from becoming part of a larger public spectacle. And that decision shaped the years that followed in ways the public does not directly see. Because in the end, this part of the story is not about what was visible to the public. It's about what remained after the cameras were gone, after the headlines faded, and after the events themselves were no longer unfolding in real time. What was left behind was not just an incident to be studied, but a family has been permanently changed. And that's where the story truly shifts. Not back to facts, but to what those facts meant for the people who lived beyond them. Phil Hartman wasn't just funny. That's the simplest way people describe him. But it's also the least complete. Because his real strength wasn't just in delivering jokes or playing characters or reading lines with perfect timing. It was in what happened around him. He made other people better. That's a rare quality in any field, but especially in comedy, where attention is often the currency. Phil didn't compete for it in the usual way. Instead, he created conditions where others could perform at their best. On shows like Saturday Night Live, News Radio, and through his voice work on The Simpsons, he became the person who held scenes together, the one who gave structure to chaos, the one who allowed others to take risks without losing control of the moment. That kind of presence doesn't always show up in highlight reels. It shows up in how a room feels when someone is there. Stable, prepared, reliable. At the time of his death, Phil Hartman was not in decline. He wasn't stepping away from work. He wasn't struggling to stay relevant. Professionally, he was still active, still contributing, still expanding his range across television, film, and voice acting. His trajectory had not stalled. It was continuing forward. And that matters, because it changes how the outcome is understood. This wasn't the end of a fading career. It was the interruption of one that still had momentum. He had already proven his range. He had already built credibility across multiple platforms. And he had done it in a way that didn't depend on constant reinvention. His identity wasn't built on being the loudest voice in a room. It was built on consistency, on reliability, on understanding how to make things work every time. And then it stopped, not gradually, not in a way that allowed for a final project, a final performance, or a final transition. It ended suddenly, at a point where there was no indication that his professional story was nearing completion. That abrupt ending is part why his legacy feels so distinct. Because audiences didn't just lose a performer, they enjoyed watching. They lost a presence that had become embedded in multiple iconic productions. What remains is the work, characters that still exist in reruns, clips, and cultural memory, performances that continue to be studied for timing, restraint, and execution, moments that still hold up because they were built on fundamentals rather than trends. But beyond the performances, there's something less visible, a reputation among peers, a standard of professionalism, a model of how to contribute without overshadowing others. Phil Hartman's legacy isn't defined by a single role. It's defined by a pattern of showing up prepared, understanding the structure of a scene, supporting the people around him, and delivering performances that elevated the whole. That kind of impact doesn't always get labeled as leadership, but it is. He wasn't remembered because he demanded attention. He was remembered because he earned trust. And in an industry built on visibility, he proved that some of the most important work happens in the background, in the timing, the balance, and the choices that make everything else possible. And when his story reached its end, it wasn't because his work had run out of momentum. It was because life itself had taken a different turn. What remains, then, is not just what happened, but what he contributed while he was here. And in that sense, his influence continues, not through interruption, but through everything he helped create before it. The easiest version of this story is the wrong one, not because it's entirely false in its facts, but because it reduces something complex into something that feels simple, clean, and contained. Real events like this rarely behave that way. They don't begin with a clear turning point. They don't build toward an obvious conclusion, and they seldom announce themselves as final in the moment they occur. It's tempting to frame this case as a single night that changed everything, but that framing misses what was already in motion long before that night arrived. This isn't just a tragedy anchored to one point in time. It's the outcome of processes that develop gradually, often without clear visibility from the outside. Some of the most important elements in situations like this are not dramatic events. They are patterns, repeated behaviors, recurring tensions, small signals that, on their own, may not appear significant, but over time begin to form a structure. In many real-world cases involving households and relationships, those patterns don't register as urgent in isolation. They exist in the background. They are normalized, adapted to, worked around. And because they don't always escalate in a visible, linear way, they can be difficult to recognize as something that might eventually converge into a breaking point. Unresolved tension is not always loud. It doesn't always manifest as constant conflict. Sometimes it lingers quietly present, but not actively addressed in a way that leads to resolution. In environments where multiple stressors coexist, emotional strain, personal challenges, external pressures, tension can accumulate without a clear mechanism for release. Not every disagreement is revisited. Not every underlying issue is fully addressed. Not every moment of friction is repaired in a lasting way. Over time, this can create a condition where stability appears intact on the surface. Even when underlying dynamics remain unsettled, the quiet way things fall apart, The phrase falling apart often implies something visible and sudden, but in reality, breakdowns can also be gradual and quiet. They may not be marked by a single decisive moment until the very end. Instead, they can unfold through accumulated stress, unresolved interpersonal dynamics, impaired decision-making under pressure, and limited capacity to stabilize a situation once it begins to shift. In that sense, the fall is often not one event. It's the point at which multiple factors align at the same time, without warning to those inside the situation that the threshold has been crossed. Nothing about that day looked like the end. From the outside, there was no clear indication that this specific point in time would become definitive, no visible marker that would distinguish it in advance as a final moment in a sequence of events. That's what makes cases like this difficult to fully process, because hindsight allows us to assign meaning retroactively. We can identify outcomes, trace sequences, and reconstruct timelines. But at the moment those events were unfolding, there was no label attached to them that said, "This is the end." This story resists simplification, not because its facts are unclear, but because its meaning is distributed across time, behavior, and circumstance. It is not defined by a single cause. It is not explained by a single factor, and it cannot be fully understood through a single lens. Instead, it sits at the intersection of multiple elements that align in a way that led to an irreversible outcome. Patterns, tension, context, timing. Individually, none of these necessarily points to a conclusion. Together, they can, and that is the part that remains most difficult to reconcile. That events which ultimately become definitive in outcome often did not appear definitive at the moment they were happening. That gap between perception and outcome is where the deeper understanding lies, not in simplifying the story, but in recognizing how complex situations can evolve without clear signals of their final direction. And in that recognition, the story becomes less about a single moment and more about the conditions that allowed that moment to occur. Technical analysis. 1. Forensic reconstruction of the incident. The physical evidence establishes a relatively clear baseline. Multiple gunshot wounds were inflicted on Phil Hartman. There were no documented signs of a struggle. The positioning and circumstances strongly indicate he was unaware or incapacitated at the time of the attack. From a forensic standpoint, the absence of defensive wounds or disturbed environment typically suggests the victim was likely asleep, unconscious, or otherwise unable to react. The assailant had close access without resistance. The encounter was not prolonged or physically contested. These elements reduce ambiguity about how the event unfolded physically, even if they do not fully explain why it occurred. 2. Ballistics and scene interpretation. In cases involving firearms at close range, investigators typically evaluate trajectory and entry points, weapon accessibility, spent casings and firearm location, spatial consistency within the environment. The reported facts indicate a controlled interaction rather than a chaotic one. In technical terms, this suggests limited movement during the act, no evidence of defensive displacement, e.g., overturned furniture, widespread disturbance, a contained scene consistent with an incident occurring in a private residential setting. Such characteristics often align with scenarios where the victim was not actively engaged in confrontation at the time. 3. Toxicology and physiological context. Toxicology results provide additional context. Bryn Hartman had alcohol present in her system, approximate blood alcohol level around 0.12. Cocaine and prescribed medications were also present. Phil Hartman had no drugs in his system. From an analytical standpoint, this introduces several considerations. Alcohol at that level can impair judgment, reaction time, and emotional regulation. Cocaine is a stimulant that can amplify agitation, impulsivity, and physiological arousal. The combination of depressants, alcohol, and stimulants, cocaine, is known to produce unpredictable behavioral effects. Importantly, toxicology does not determine intent, but it does inform the state of mind and physiological condition at the time of the incident. 4. Behavioral pattern analysis. Investigators often evaluate behavioral history alongside physical evidence to understand context. In this case, the analytical perspective identifies a documented pattern of marital instability, reports of recurring conflict dynamics, evidence of substance involvement contributing to volatility, emotional and psychological stressors that may have been present over time. Rather than treating any single element as causal, analysts consider the interaction of these factors. 5. Access, opportunity, and means. A key technical component in many forensic cases is a convergence of access, proximity to the victim within a shared residence; opportunity, timing when the victim was vulnerable, e.g., asleep; means, availability of a firearm within the environment. In this case, those three elements appear to have aligned within the same time frame. From an investigative standpoint, such convergence is significant because it reduces external complexity. No forced entry was involved. No indication of a third-party actor. No need to explain how an external individual gained access. This narrows the scope of analysis to internal household dynamics. 6. Post-incident sequence, behavioral timeline. The sequence following the shooting is also relevant for technical reconstruction. The individual left the residence. Contact was made with a third party, a friend. The situation was disclosed, initially met with disbelief. The scene was subsequently verified. Emergency services were contacted. The individual isolated and died by suicide before police intervention. From an investigative timeline perspective, this indicates immediate acknowledgement of the event by the individual involved. No prolonged attempt to conceal or stage the scene after the fact. Rapid escalation from disclosure to emergency response. These behaviors are often documented carefully because they contribute to understanding intent, awareness, and mental state following the incident. 7. Investigative conclusion framework. Law enforcement and forensic analysts typically avoid attributing a single cause in complex cases like this. Instead, they rely on a convergence model. The conclusion is not framed as one event caused everything, one substance determined the outcome, one argument triggered the incident. Instead, it is understood as the intersection of multiple contributing domains: relationship dynamics, substance influence, emotional and psychological stress, access to a lethal means, timing, and opportunity. Each of these alone is insufficient to explain the outcome. Together, they form a context in which the event became possible. 8. Key technical insight. The most important technical takeaway is this: the case does not hinge on a single identifiable trigger, but rather on the alignment of multiple conditions that reduce barriers to escalation. In forensic and investigative analysis, this is often described as a convergence event rather than a linear causation chain. 9. Why this case is considered complex. From a technical perspective, complexity arises because physical evidence explains a mechanism, not the motive. Toxicology explains a state, not decision-making. Behavioral history explains patterns, but not precise triggers. The timeline explains the sequence, but not the internal cognitive processes. As a result, investigators can reconstruct what happened with reasonable clarity, but must remain cautious about assigning definitive psychological explanations beyond evidence. The physical evidence indicates a controlled, non-struggle scenario consistent with the victim being unaware. Toxicology suggests altered cognitive and emotional states in one party, with no substances in the other. Behavioral context points to pre-existing relational instability and stressors. The incident is best understood as a result of multiple overlapping factors rather than a single cause. The investigative framework treats the event as a convergence of access, opportunity, means, and situational conditions. Psychological analysis of the case. A psychological analysis of this case does not aim to assign a simplistic cause or label any single factor as decisive. Instead, it examines how individual mental states, interpersonal dynamics, and situational stressors can interact over time to increase risk and reduce stability within a relationship and household environment. This approach focuses on patterns of behavior, known effects of substances on cognition and emotion, and the dynamics that often precede critical incidents. 1. Individual psychological states. In examining the individuals involved, psychological analysis considers mood regulation, impulse control, stress tolerance, and decision-making under pressure. In this case, one individual, Hartman, had documented exposure to alcohol, cocaine, and prescribed medication at the time of the incident. The other individual, Phil Hartman, had no substances detected in their system. From a psychological standpoint, alcohol can lower inhibitions and impair judgment. Cocaine is associated with increased arousal, impulsivity, and in some cases, heightened emotional reactivity. The combination of substances can produce unpredictable mood and behavioral fluctuations. These factors do not determine actions on their own, but they can reduce an individual's capacity to regulate emotions and evaluate consequences in real time. 2. Emotional regulation and stress response. A key area of psychological analysis is how individuals regulate emotions during conflict. In relationships with ongoing strain, minor disagreements can escalate more quickly. Communication may become less effective. Emotional responses may intensify rather than resolve. Problem-solving may give way to reactive behavior. Over time, if conflict are not consistently resolved, individuals may develop maladaptive coping strategies, such as avoidance, escalation, or emotional withdrawal. When combined with substance use, these patterns can become more pronounced due to impaired inhibition and altered perception. 3. Interpersonal dynamics. The relationship between the two individuals showed signs of instability based on available accounts. From a psychological systems perspective, relationships operate as feedback loops. One partner's behavior influences the other's response. Responses reinforce or escalate initial behavior. Repeated cycles can form stable but unhealthy interaction patterns. In such systems, conflict is not always about a single issue. It often reflects accumulated tension across multiple domains. Trust, communication breakdown, emotional unmet needs, external stressors. When these elements persist without resolution, the system can become increasingly fragile. 4. Substance use as a modulating factor. Substance use is a significant variable in psychological analysis because it affects judgment, impulse control, emotional regulation, perception of risk, interpretation of social cues. In this case, the presence of alcohol and cocaine in one individual suggests a state in which emotional reactions may have been intensified, cognitive control may have been reduced, decision-making may have been more reactive than reflective. It is important to emphasize that substance use is not treated as a sole cause, but as a factor that can amplify existing psychological and relational vulnerabilities. 5. Crisis escalation dynamics. Psychological crisis theory helps explain how situations escalate to critical points. Typical contributing elements include accumulated stress without resolution, reduced coping capacity, impaired communication, emotional flooding, overwhelming emotional state, limited ability to de-escalate conflict in real time. In high-stress relational environments, a triggering moment may not appear significant in isolation, but can interact with pre-existing tension and internal states to produce disproportionate reactions. This does not imply inevitability. Rather, it describes how multiple pressures can converge under constrained conditions. 6. Decision-making under impairment. Decision-making is heavily influenced by both cognitive and emotional factors. Under conditions of substance influence, emotional distress, relationship conflict, sleep disruption or fatigue where applicable, individuals may exhibit reduced foresight, increased impulsivity, narrowed focus on immediate emotional relief rather than long-term consequences, difficulty inhibiting harmful or risky actions. Psychologically, this is associated with diminished executive function, the set of cognitive processes responsible for planning, inhibition, and self-control. 7. Post-incident behavior and acute psychological collapse. Following the incident, the subsequent actions of the individual involved, leaving the residence, disclosing the event to a third party, and ultimately taking their own life, are often interpreted through the lens of acute psychological crisis. From a clinical perspective, such behavior can be associated with overwhelming guilt or distress, cognitive overload following a critical event, sudden loss of perceived control, collapse of coping mechanisms. The transition from disclosure to isolation and then to suicide indicates a rapid escalation in psychological distress within a very short time frame. 8. Convergence of psychological factors. Rather than identifying a single psychological explanation, analysts typically describe this case as a convergence of multiple interacting domains: chronic relational stress, emotional instability, substance-induced impairment, communication breakdown, reduced impulse control, situational access and proximity. Each factor alone does not fully explain the outcome. Together, they create conditions under which normal behavioral safeguards may fail. 9. Limitations of psychological interpretation. It is important to recognize the boundaries of psychological analysis. Internal subjective experiences cannot be fully reconstructed after the fact. Retrospective interpretations may overestimate coherence in events that were chaotic in real time. Diagnoses cannot be definitively assigned without direct clinical evaluation. Motives remain partially inferential rather than directly observable. Therefore, psychological analysis in this context focuses on probability, patterns, and contributing influences rather than definitive explanations. 10. Key psychological insight. The central psychological takeaway is: critical incidents in relational contexts are rarely the result of a single mental state or isolated trigger, but rather the interaction of impaired regulation, accumulated stress, and environmental factors that reduce the ability to de-escalate. Emotional regulation and interpersonal dynamics played a central role in shaping the environment. Substance use likely contributed to impaired judgment and increased emotional reactivity in one individual. Chronic relational strain may have created a baseline of unresolved tension. Acute stress and impaired cognitive control reduce the ability to navigate conflict safely. The event can be understood as a convergence of psychological vulnerabilities rather than a single determining cause. The aftermath of this case is not fully understood by focusing only on the incident itself. The most enduring effects are found in the lives of those who were closest to it, particularly the children of Phil Hartman and Bryn Hartman. 2 children were left behind in the wake of a situation that unfolded within their own home. In psychological and developmental terms, this kind of loss is not just an event. It is a foundational disruption. It alters a child's sense of safety, identity, and continuity in ways that can influence their development for years to come. The most direct and undeniable consequence was a simultaneous loss of both parents. For children, parents are typically the primary source of emotional security, stability and routine, identity formation, guidance and protection. Losing both parents at once creates a sudden and absolute shift in the environment. There is no gradual adjustment period, no opportunity for closure, and no continuity of caregiving from the original household. This type of loss is considered highly significant in developmental psychology because it removes both the emotional anchor and the structural framework of a child's daily life. Following the incident, the children were placed with family members. This transition served 2 essential purposes: continuity of care, ensuring that the children remain in a familial network, helped provide stability during an otherwise disruptive time; protection from external exposure. Being raised outside of public attention reduced the likelihood of ongoing media intrusion, shaping their development. From a psychological standpoint, placement within the family can mitigate some of the destabilizing effects of parental loss by preserving a sense of belonging and identity, even in the absence of the parents themselves. Another important factor in their upbringing was a deliberate effort to maintain privacy. Because of the public profile of Phil Hartman through work on shows such as Saturday Night Live and The Simpsons, there was significant media interest in the case. However, the children were largely shielded from that exposure. This decision had long-term implications. It limited repeated exposure to external narratives about the incident. It reduced the likelihood of identity being shaped by public association with the tragedy. It allowed for a more normalized developmental environment despite the circumstances. In many high-profile cases, ongoing media attention can complicate healing. In this instance, privacy acted as a stabilizing protective factor. Psychological and emotional effects. While the specific personal experiences of the children are not publicly detailed and should remain private, the general psychological impact of losing both parents in childhood is well understood in developmental research. Common long-term areas of effect may include attachment and trust. adjusting to new caregivers and redefining secure relationships. Identity formation, reconciling personal history with the absence of biological parents. Emotional processing, working through grief that may evolve over different stages of life. Resilience development, learning coping strategies in the presence of early adversity. Importantly, outcomes vary significantly depending on support systems, environment, and individual temperament. Stable caregiving, emotional support, and privacy can all contribute positively to long-term adjustment. One of the most critical protective factors for children in such situations is stability. In this case, stability came from placement within the family, removal from public scrutiny, continuity in education and daily life, a structured environment that did not constantly reintroduce the trauma. These elements do not erase the loss, but they can help reduce additional stressors that might otherwise compound the original event. Unlike the public narrative, which often focuses on the incident itself, the children's experience continued quietly over time. Their lives were not defined solely by the event, but they were undeniably shaped by it. This is a subtle but important distinction. The story does not end with the incident. It extends into years of adaptation, growth, and personal development away from public view. When examining this case fully, it becomes clear that the most lasting consequences are not found in headlines or timelines. They are found in the human lives that continued afterward. 2 children had to grow up without the presence of both parents, supported instead by extended family and protected from public exposure. That combination of care and privacy played a crucial role in shaping their path forward. If you find these deeper, human-centered explorations of complex crime cases valuable, consider subscribing for more in-depth breakdowns like this. There are many cases where the surface story is only a small part of the full picture, and the real understanding comes from examining the context, the psychology, and the lasting impact on the people involved. Subscribe to stay updated on more detailed analyses of cases that go beyond the headlines.